there, my name is Dr. Buckley, and I have been a professor in the psychology department at Mercer University for the past 8 years. And if you are watching this video, you have decided to join me for a semester of research as a Sci 290 or Sci 495 student. So thank you so much for being here, and I can't wait to share some of the aspects of my research with you. So, as I'm sure that you know, I am a cognitive psychologist, and the particular area of research that I'm especially passionate about is learning and memory. Right? So a lot of people, when they hear that I am a memory psychologist, they assume that I work exclusively with maybe people with dementia or Alzheimer's or individuals who have suffered a stroke or maybe some kind of head injury that has resulted in amnesia, for example. And those are great examples of sort of applied things that cognitive psychologists specializing in memory might be involved in. But rather than being an applied cognitive psychologist, a lot of my research is couched within the domain of basic psychology, right? So what does basic psychology mean? Basic psychology is essentially predominantly research in the laboratory that seeks to help other scientists understand just the general mechanisms of memory and how they work, right? So rather than working with patients in an applied setting like a nursing home or a hospital, most of my research comes from working with college students. And sometimes I focus on some applied context. So sometimes I focus on particular strategies that students and instructors can use to promote better memory for material, right? But a lot of my research has focused on forgetting, right? But not the kinds of pathological forgetting that we see with Alzheimer's or with dementia, but rather the everyday kind of failures of memory that we all experience. Okay? So I'm interested in sort of normal everyday forgetting that is common for everyone. Okay? So I'm going to talk in this video predominantly about my research on forgetting. Okay? And the title that I have chosen is The Perils and Promise of Memory Retrieval. Okay, so I'm going to focus on what happens when information is pulled out of long-term memory. And there are certain things that are advantageous about memory retrieval. Most notably, what's advantageous about memory retrieval is that whatever you attempt to recall is going to be easier to recall later on, right? So that's the promise of memory retrieval, is that retrieved memories become stronger than they would have been otherwise. So you might ask, what about the perils of memory retrieval? Well, the perils of memory retrieval is that information that's related to the information that you just recalled is forgotten. So let me start out by giving you two examples of how that might be advantageous. So let's say that, like me, you are an employee on Mercer's campus, okay? And maybe you get a job at Mercer right after graduation, and you're so excited about Mercer, you're so excited to be the bear that you decide to work at this job for the next 50 years. And over the course of those 50 years, you always park near the same building, right? So maybe you always park near Willett, near the Science Center where psychology is. Or maybe you always park near the admissions building, right? Or the dean's office. Or maybe you always park near the student center, right? But let's say you always park in that general vicinity for your entire career as a Mercerian for 50 years, right? So let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have a perfect memory in the sense that you never forget anything. Okay? So you have a perfect memory, which means on any given day of the week, throughout that entire 50 years, right, you have a perfect recollection of where you parked your car. So you might think that sounds fantastic, right? If we can get rid of this nuisance of forgetting, that would be like a superpower, right? But imagine what would start to happen, right? So if your mind collects all of these instances, all of these memories of where you parked your car over 50 years, right? There's going to be sort of this overloading effect where your mind gets really cluttered, right? With the same sorts of memories. Okay. And it turns out that we only have a limited capacity to recall information or retrieve information from long-term memory, right? So if your mind is sort of bogged down with all of these instances of where you parked your car, right? On any given day, when you try to remember on your way home where your car is parked, you're going to have to go through this kind of Rolodex or really, really long catalog of memories, right? Because your memory is perfect, which means you have all of these different mental postcards, so to speak, to sort through, or mental index cards to sort through to find where you parked your car today, right? So all that is to say, we make the argument as scientists that forgetting is adaptive because forgetting is a mechanism that allows you to update memory. Okay, so forgetting is a mechanism that allows you to kind of select against memories that are no longer relevant, okay, so that memories that are relevant become more accessible. Similarly, right? Imagine that something really embarrassing happens to you, right? So maybe you're at work and you see a colleague and you ask that colleague if they're pregnant, right? And you congratulate them on being pregnant, but it turns out they're not pregnant, right? So now every time that you see that person, it's super, super embarrassing and you regret kind of that awkward encounter, right? Well, if you have to work with that person for the next 10 or 20 years, right? If you remember in perfect detail when you had that conversation, right? And sort of their indignant tone when they told you, no, I'm in fact not pregnant, right? That would make it a terrible place to work, right? Because you would constantly be reminded of that embarrassing conversation, right? So you need a mechanism that allows you to forget those experiences that might be distressing or embarrassing for you. That's another way that forgetting can be helpful. Okay? So let's get into the video and talk about that kind of adaptive mechanism. Okay. So anytime I talk about memory, the first place that I end up in that conversation is I end up talking about scientific metaphors or scientific analogies, right? So one of the best devices that we have at our disposal as scientists is the use of metaphor, right? Because really, the job of a scientist is to attempt to explain something that is unknown, right? And you might think that's a really tall order, right? But fortunately, while the area that we're currently exploring is often novel, we also have access to years and centuries worth of knowledge, right? So why not tap into something that is known, right? To try to understand something that is known, right? So for example, scientists have used what we know about the solar system, right, to explain how subatomic particles work, right? So it turns out that many different metaphors have been proposed for how memory works, and many of those originated kind of at the dawn of civilization with philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. So, for example, Plato likened memory to a wax tablet. And he used that metaphor of a wax tablet to explain individual differences in memory, right? So, to explain why some people are really forgetful and other people have really good memories, he said that the mind is like a wax tablet, okay? And our experiences and events that happen to us imprint themselves upon this wax tablet. And some people have really intense experiences that naturally make an impression upon their mind, right? That's lasting. Whereas other people, their experiences are really shallow and don't tend to make a lasting impression upon that wax tablet. Similarly, so not only did Plato talk about the process of encoding or getting information into memory, he also talked about retrieval or getting information out of memory. And so when he talked about retrieval, he used the metaphor of an aviary, which is basically just a big cage full of birds. And he said, sometimes we call to a bird, okay, and the exact bird that we're thinking of flies into our hand, right? So sometimes we attempt to retrieve something or call it to mind, and the exact memory that we're looking for, that we're searching for, is recalled. But he said other times we call for a bird in our aviary and we get one that's similar, but not quite the bird we were looking for, right? So that's kind of analogous to a memory phenomenon known as interference. So if we study a bunch of different things that are similar, they often become confusable in memory and we mix them up, right? So I've talked about philosophers from long ago and their conceptualization of memory, but a much more recent metaphor is thinking about memory as a tape recorder, right? So a lot of people think of memory as functioning like a recording device, right? So when experiences happen to us, our minds kind of hit the record button and encode the experience as it's happening, similar to the way that we would tape a video on our phones. And when the time comes for us to retrieve that information, we simply play it back exactly as it happens. And in fact, when I ask my intro psych students if they agree with the statement that memories work like a video recording, when I recall something that has happened to me, I am metaphorically playing it back to myself. 79% of my introductory psychology students endorse that as being true, right? But it turns out that all of those metaphors are incredibly misleading. So memory is not a passive process. Information must be paid attention to and interacted with before it can enter long-term memory. Memory is also not precarious, okay? It is driven by a number of factors, okay? So the first bullet point was kind of talking about that encoding process, how you get information into memory. But now let's talk about retrieval. So memory retrieval is not precarious or haphazard, right? It is driven by a number of factors that can be quantified and understood, right? And it's possible to improve your ability to retrieve memories, provided that you adopt certain strategies. And the final bullet point that I alluded to in my title, The Promise and Perils of Memory Retrieval, is that retrieval is a memory modifier. Memories are fundamentally changed as a result of that retrieval process, right? So I'm just going to review what I said at the beginning of the video, right? Retrieval is a memory modifier in the sense that information that is retrieved, right? So information that we try to access from our long-term memory, okay? Those memories are going to be strengthened in the sense that it's easier for us to recall that information later on. However, right, the perils of memory is that information that is related to the information that we practice retrieving is going to become less accessible. Okay, so let's look at some data. Let's look at some science experiments. So this was a very, very famous experiment conducted by two very famous cognitive psychologists, Roediger and Karpicki, in the early 2000s. And it's as famous of an experiment as it was, it's actually really nice because it's really elegant and really simple and really easy to follow. So it's a great example for teaching. So in this experiment, the particular materials that they chose to kind of examine memory in undergraduates is they chose reading comprehension passages that might be used in the context of the SAT or the GRE or the TOEFL exam, right? So their participants simply read prose passages on unusual topics like the life cycle of the star or the sun or sea otters, right? Things that most people aren't likely to have, really robust memories about. So in this experiment, right, participants would read passages, okay? And one group of participants in yellow here would read the passage for 5 minutes, okay? And then the experimenter would snatch away the passage and hand it right back to the participant and say, okay, read it again for 5 minutes, okay? And that would continue over the course of 4 intervals of 5 minutes, okay? So these participants essentially read a passage over and over and over again for 20 minutes. And then, after 5 minutes, the experimenter handed the participant a blank sheet of paper and said, okay, now I want you to write down everything you can remember about sea otters or the life cycle of a star or the sun. Okay? And then a week later, the same participants were brought in again and given the exact same memory test where they had to write down every single thing they could remember about the passage. Okay? And we contrasted that group of participants with a group of participants that read the passage, okay, for 5 minutes, okay? And then for the other 3 5-minute intervals, the researcher would give them a blank sheet of paper and say, write down everything you can remember about sea otters. Okay? And then they would take up the paper and again hand them a blank sheet of paper after 5 minutes and say, okay, again, write down everything you can remember about sea otters. Okay? So the difference between the yellow group and the blue group is that the yellow group read the passage for 20 minutes, whereas the blue group read the passage for 5 minutes and then took successive tests on the passage for 15 minutes. And in both cases, okay, no feedback was given on the test. Okay, so participants weren't told, oh, you correctly recalled all of the facts about sea otters or anything like that. Okay, and both groups again were given a test 5 minutes later and a week later, where they simply had to write down everything they could remember about the passage. And the first thing we see, let's look at the 5-minute test. Okay, so on the 5-minute test, those that studied more remembered more. Okay, so the people that studied the passage for 20 minutes were able to recall about 80% of what they read in the passage, compared to people that read the passage for just 5 minutes. Okay, they only recalled about 70% of the passage. Okay, so on an immediate test or a test very shortly after reading the material, okay, those that studied more remembered more. But interestingly, that pattern reversed for individuals such that those that studied the passage and initially recalled 80%, now a week later lost or forgot 50% of that information. Okay, so their recall dropped from 80% to 40%. Now let's look at the blue bars. Individuals who studied the passage for 5 minutes, okay, were able to recall 70% initially, okay, and their recall was still at about 60 or 65% 1 week later, okay. So even though those given a passage 20 minutes to study the passage initially remembered more, they lost or forgot 50% of that information over the course of 1 week, compared to individuals that took successive tests or were given multiple chances to practice retrieving what they knew. Okay, so even though they remembered less of the passage initially, they were able to retain that information far longer. Okay, so let's go back to our original question, right? So how does the retrieval process alter our memories, right? Well, there's promise in memory retrieval in the sense that information that is retrieved can become more recallable than it would have been otherwise, right? So we call this the testing effect, the fact that or taking successive tests on a passage, as opposed to simply reading a passage over and over again, okay, results in better long-term learning than simply reading a passage. So retrieval is a potent learning event, right? So long-term learning is better when you test yourself than when you simply restudy or reread, right? So this implication means that testing is beneficial, not just for assessment or to tell you what you know, right? But also to enhance your learning, right? So based on that idea, right, that retrieval can be helpful, Okay? The most optimal study strategies are going to be things like using flashcards, writing notes in your own words, quizzing yourself, or taking practice tests, right? So the information that you practice retrieving, right, is the information that's going to be easiest for you to recall later on. Now let's shift things a bit and talk about the perils of memory retrieval, right? So just like I've hinted at, right? While retrieved information gets stronger in memory, information that is not retrieved gets weaker, okay? So related information that is not retrieved can become less recallable than it would have been otherwise, right? So the name for this phenomenon is retrieval induced forgetting, and it's abbreviated RIF. Okay, so let's look at another example. So this study was conducted by Carroll and colleagues also in the first decade of the 2000s, right? And it's very nice. It's very similar to the Roediger and Karpicki study in that it's simple, it's elegant, and it very clearly illustrates these processes, right? So it's great. It's great for teaching purposes. Okay? So in this experiment, as in all retrieval-induced forgetting experiments, there are three phases. Okay? So in this case, in the first phase, participants read two passages from a textbook. And each passage in the textbook, okay, contained answers to 20 questions. Okay, so participants were told to study each passage carefully and be prepared to answer questions about them, right? So the passage in blue, these passages were from an abnormal psychology textbook, okay? And they were case studies. So the passage in blue was a case study on schizophrenia and featured a young man named Austin, whereas the second case study in yellow featured a young man named Peter who had autism. Okay, so again, just like in the Roediger and Karpicki study, right, the first step is just studying or reading material, right? So they read both the passages, okay? And then this is when the testing happened, right? Initial testing. So the researchers, Carroll and colleagues, okay, took one of the passages. So they took the passage about Austin with schizophrenia, and they had the participants answer 10 questions. Okay, for example, a question might be, what was Austin's first hallucination? Okay, so if you recall, right, there's a total of 20 questions worth of information in both passages, right? So what they've done for that initial test is they've taken one of the passages and tested participants on half of the questions, right? So if you're tracking this, right, hopefully you're tracking this with me, right? What would our predictions be on a final test, right? Well, our prediction would be, according to the testing effect, that the 10 questions that participants were asked about Austin, right, such as what was Austin's first hallucination, by virtue of the fact that they've taken an initial test on those questions, right? On the final test, those questions should be remembered better, right? That's the testing effect. That's the promise of memory retrieval, right? What about the perils, right? Well, the perils of memory retrieval is what happens to the other half of the questions, okay? So the 10 questions about Austin, they haven't been asked about yet, right? Those questions should be less well remembered, right? And the comparison group, when I say better remembered or less well remembered, is that other passage, right? So that other passage in yellow, okay? So again, on the final test, participants were asked all 20 questions from both passages. So they answered a total of 40 questions. Okay, right? And just like I was alluding to before, the first thing the researchers found is that questions that participants were asked during that initial test, okay, were better recalled than any of the information from that yellow passage that wasn't tested, okay? So again, we see a testing effect or the promise of memory retrieval. Information that was tested initially or information that was subject to memory retrieval practice, okay, is recalled better on the final test than information that was not initially tested, right? So this is basically just a replication of the Roediger and Karpicki study, okay? So we have a testing effect, okay? Now, let's look at what happened to the other questions about Austin that weren't tested, right? Well, the other questions, okay, well, okay, I should say that it was predicted for a long time, right? That questions related to the questions that they were asked about, okay, would be better than the questions from the untested passage, right? So think to yourself for a minute, if you answered 10 questions about Austin, right? You could probably use the 10 questions that you answered, right, to help you try to recall the rest of the information, right? And in fact, that was what was predicted for a long time. And this is known um, as this is known as the spreading activation hypothesis, that when some topic, right? In this case, the topic is Austin, right? When you practice some of the information related to a topic in memory, it should enhance information related to the topic. But in fact, what the researchers found was the opposite, right? So again, the researchers found evidence of retrieval-induced forgetting that related but not initially tested information is recalled more poorly, okay? So people actually found it harder to remember the other questions from the passage about Austin than they did to remember any of the questions about Peter, right? So what does this suggest, right? It means that retrieval in memory enhances memory for retrieved information, okay? But it can impair recall for related information that's not retrieved, okay? So therefore, retrieving what we already know can actually contribute to forgetting, okay? And when I was in graduate school, I was part of a team that conducted something known as a meta-analysis. So basically with a meta-analysis, what you're doing is you're taking all of the data from published articles about a particular phenomenon, and you're sort of analyzing all of the results together to identify not only the strength of an effect, but also how the effect generalizes, right? So in our study, we looked at 200 published articles on retrieval-induced forgetting, okay? And we found that it was a very, very consistent and robust finding. And it's been demonstrated with a lot of different materials. So we find it just like in the Carroll et al. 2007 study, we find it with text passages. We also find it with visual spatial materials like pictures. We find it with general world knowledge, such as lists of words or mathematical equations. Okay, we find it with videos, and we also find it with different test types. So we find it with free recall, where we ask people to simply generate what they know, like we saw in the Roediger and Karpicki study. We find it with cued recall, and we find it with recognition tests, right? So this is a very, very robust finding. So let's look at how this retrieval-induced forgetting phenomenon is typically studied in the laboratory, right? So I gave you one example of participants studying text passages, but we also most often study retrieval-induced forgetting with simple word pairs, right? So again, we have three phases. We have a study phase, we have an initial test, and then we have a final test, right? So in the initial study phase, participants study a list of categorized word pairs derived from a number of different categories, right? So for example, participants might study fruits, apple, right? So notice that the first word in the pair is a category, and the second word is an example of a word in that category, right? So they might study fruits apple, fruits lemon, fruits banana, and fruits strawberry, okay? And then maybe they'll study a series of trees, right? Trees birch, hickory, dogwood, elm, okay? One thing I should mention though is that these words are always mixed up, or most of the time they're mixed up. So you wouldn't study all the fruits and all the trees, you would study kind of a mixture of all the words, right? And so typically we give people a list of 48 word pairs. So those 48 word pairs, you have 6 items or 6 examples from 8 different categories, right? So participants study this long list of word pairs, each drawn from different categories, right? So they study all those word pairs, and then on the initial test phase, just like when they studied 2 passages and they were asked half the questions on one of the passages, right? In this case, with this paradigm, we're going to do the same thing, right? So we have 2 categories. So during that initial test, we're going to test participants on one of those categories, okay? So we're going to focus in on fruits, and we're only going to test them on half the fruits. So we're going to test them on fruits apple and fruits lemon. And then we're going to compare their recall for the items in blue that they were tested on, the items in black from a totally different category that they weren't tested on, and the items in red. So the items in red are the related items from the category that they were tested on. Okay? And we see the same pattern of results, right? So first we see the benefits or promises of retrieval in the form of a testing effect, right? So if we compare participants' recall for the practiced items, fruit apple and fruit lemon, to the totally unpracticed category of trees elm, trees hickory, right? We see that the items that they studied initially are going to be recalled better, right? So that's a testing effect or the benefits of retrieval. But we also see the perils, right, of retrieval in the sense that the items related to what was retrieved or the other fruits that weren't practiced are going to be harder to recall than the items from the totally untested category. Okay? So again, how is retrieval modifying memory? Right? Retrieval is modifying memory in that the items that are given memory or retrieval practice, right? The items that we take an initial test on, okay, are going to be recalled better than items from the category that wasn't tested, okay? So that's the testing effect or the benefits of retrieval. But we also see this retrieval-induced forgetting phenomenon whereby, right, items related to those which are retrieved become less recallable compared to the items that were from the category that was not retrieved. Okay? So let's take a look at what happens, right? Why does this occur? And while I'm telling you about this particular theory of why retrieval-induced forgetting occurs, I want you to think back to those two examples I gave you at the beginning of this talk, right? So I gave you the example of working at Mercer for 50 years, assuming you had a perfect memory, right? How that would be problematic, right? Because you would have to sort through a mental box of index cards, right? And on each index card, it would be where you parked on a given day in the course of 50 years. And you would have to sort of mentally sort through this gigantic container, right? To find where you parked on that given day, right? So forgetting is helpful because it updates memory and allows you to focus on only what's relevant, right? And forgetting is also helpful because it preserves your psychological well-being and that it can sometimes protect you from having intrusive memories of things that are distressing or embarrassing or traumatic, okay? So keep that in mind, right? So what's happening in this paradigm where we see retrieval-induced forgetting? Well, this is the theory, guys. This is the theory. So during that retrieval practice phase, when those participants see fruit colon AP, okay, when they go to retrieve that item, right, apple is going to become, is going to get activated in their memory, right? But so is, because we have that category label of fruit, right? The correct answer, apple, is going to get activated, but so is lemon, strawberry, and banana, right? So remember I told you about this phenomenon of interference whereby similar things kind of compete with each other and get confusable, right? So in order to facilitate successful retrieval of apple, right? What happens in the retrieval practice paradigm, right, is that these competing items get suppressed. So these competing items get get forgotten, right? And it's not a passive process, okay? This is an active control process, right? So the way that memory retrieval is structured, in order to overcome the interference created by all of these different fruits, right? The competitors that we don't want, that are accessible or present in our memories, get selected against or suppressed to facilitate the correct recall of apple. Okay? And this is a theory known as the retrieval inhibition theory, or the retrieval inhibition hypothesis. And it says, okay, that there's something known as motivated or goal-directed forgetting, okay? And in this context, right, our motivation or goal is to facilitate retrieval of something relevant, okay? So it's the goal of making what is most relevant to us most recallable or most accessible in our minds, okay? So forgetting is not just a passive incidental process, but rather it's a volitional mechanism. So we have a mechanism that both facilitates recall of what is relevant, okay, and selects against or prevents us from recalling what is not relevant. Okay, so again, to summarize, retrieval holds promise in that retrieval is a potent learning event whereby information that is retrieved is much easier to remember later on. Retrieval can also be somewhat perilous in the sense that related information that is not retrieved and deemed irrelevant or outdated can be forgotten, right? But the good news is that even perilous events, such as that retrieval-induced forgetting, actually functions for the better, right? So it's kind of a misnomer to say that forgetting is perilous or retrieval-induced forgetting is perilous, right? Because the consequence of retrieval-induced forgetting, right, is that the most relevant information or information that we need the most, okay, is going to be what's recalled in memory, okay? So just to preview one of the readings that I ask all of my research students to do is that what I've shown you is retrieval-induced forgetting in the laboratory, right? So I've shown you kind of the basic research side of retrieval-induced forgetting. But retrieval-induced forgetting has also been studied in applied contexts, right? So I'll just go through some examples here really quick, right? So in the field of eyewitness memory, retrieval-induced forgetting is relevant because law enforcement officials, right, when they have an eyewitness come into their, I almost said their laboratory, when they have an eyewitness to a crime, for example, come to the police station, right, they initially get an account of the event, right? So, for example, the participant comes in and says, I saw the robber, he was dressed all in black, he was wearing a ski mask, and he was carrying a knife, right? So chances are that in subsequent interviews, of which there are many for eyewitnesses who have seen a crime, chances are that the police are going to focus their questions predominantly on the weapon, okay, predominantly on maybe the sequence of events, right? Um, but there's only a certain subset of information, usually, that criminal investigators are going to want to focus on. Like I said, usually it's relevant to the weapon, things like that. But because we know that memory retrieval can be both promising and perilous, right? What happens is that whatever pieces of information are highlighted by investigators and questioned about over and over and over and over, right? That information is going to become more recallable or easier to access later on, right? But we also have this other consequence, right? This other consequence is that information that investigators don't ask about over and over and over again is going to be less recallable, right? So what that means is that the account, right, that gets strengthened by that questioning is going to be incomplete in the sense that only questioned info is going to get stronger in memory. Okay, so you'll read about that. You'll also read about retrieval-induced forgetting in an educational context and what happens, for example, when students take a practice test, right? So typically, if you take a practice test, that means that only the information that you're tested on, okay, is going to get strengthened in memory. So what about the information that you're not tested on? Okay. You're also going to read about socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting, or the fact that retrieval-induced forgetting happens both for people actively retrieving the information and for people simply observing that process. You're also going to read about stereotypes in and how those get strengthened and weakened as a result of retrieval-induced forgetting. And you're also going to read about retrieval-induced forgetting and autobiographical memory, right? So what happens to memories that are retrieved and not retrieved? For example, in people suffering from depression, okay? Or memories that are particularly emotional, right? What happens to those memories? Okay, so you're going to read about that, but hopefully this provided a good introduction for you into the phenomenon of retrieval-induced forgetting, so that when you come into the lab and start working for me, you'll have a better sense of what we will be studying in the lab. Okay, so thanks again for hanging out with me for the past almost hour and talking about cognitive psychology research. Okay, and hopefully I'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.